Welcome back to the Nest, peeps. In today's video, we're going to start a series where I take you through my painting journey and pick out key moments where I feel like I leveled up. When I first started learning how to paint minis back in 2018, one of the first things I did was jump on the YouTube. I typed in how to paint minis in the search bar and went down that rabbit hole. From there, I picked up the Army Painter starter set, a couple of synthetic brushes, and a dry palette. And I just jumped in head first and started slapping paint on minis, slowly learning how to add water to my paints and thin them down to the right consistency that I needed to paint. However, I kept finding that no matter how much water I added, eventually that paint would start to dry up again. And it was from this frustration of my paint drying out that I had my first level up moment. And that was when I discovered the wet palette. Now, I first found out about the wet palette from a video that Uncle Adam over at Tabletop Minions did about creating your own. I'll put a link to that video in the description down below. Now, why this appealed to me was because as a beginning painter, I didn't really want to throw a bunch of money into the hobby if I wasn't going to stick with it. So building my own wet palette from a Tupperware container, paper towels, and parchment paper was right up my alley because I already had all of those items in my kitchen. Now, when you're first using a wet palette, especially this DIY one, it takes a little bit of finesse to figure out exactly how much water and dampness you want in that palette. I've kind of come to the conclusion that for every painter that's a little different depending on how you like to paint. Once I was able to dial that in, I noticed an immediate improvement in my painting. Whereas before, I had to deal with seeing brush strokes in my paint and not really getting a smooth layer. Now, I was getting those smooth layers and I didn't have to struggle with the hydration of my paints. Once I realized I was going to stick with the hobby, I decided it was time for me to purchase a legitimate wet palette. So I started paying attention to what other painters on YouTube were using. And the one that I seen most used and came most highly recommended was the Masterson's Handy Palette. This thing is fantastic for what it is. The palette comes with a sponge and I believe some papers. The paper that comes with the Masterson Handy Palette, however, is trash. Throw it in the garbage and continue to use parchment paper. The Masterson Handy Palette is the palette that I would recommend to any beginner painter. It's low cost and ease of use make it absolutely perfect. And honestly, even intermediate and advanced painters, the Masterson palette is kind of like the staple. This is the palette that you compare everything else to. After many paint sessions, the sponge and the Masterson eventually started to go. So instead of just buying a new sponge for the Masterson, I decided to use this opportunity as an excuse to purchase a new wet palette. But in this wet palette, I wanted something a little bit more compact so that it was out of my way while I was painting. And the wet palette that I decided on is the Army Painter wet palette. The Army Painter wet palette is a little bit smaller than the Masterson's, but it's pretty awesome because it has these storage areas here where you can put some brushes if you're going to go paint at the shop or go over to a buddy's house for a paint session. However, even with the band on it, I would recommend not traveling with water in the wet palette because it is not watertight and it will spill everywhere. Travel with the palette dry and set it up once you get to your location. Now, with the Army Painter palette, I ran into the same situation as the Masterson when it comes to the quality of the paper that comes with the palette. Again, the paper, trash. Throw it away, use parchment paper. For whatever reason, all the paper that comes with any wet palette I've ever used has sucked. Just use parchment paper. You're going to save yourself a lot of time and a lot of frustration. Now, with the Army Painter palette, the sponge that it comes with is different. I'm not necessarily sure if I'm a fan of this or not. I've been using this palette for about a year, half a year, somewhere around there now, and I do really enjoy the palette, but the sponge in here can be a little bit of a pain in the butt when you're trying to rehydrate it. For whatever reason, it just doesn't absorb like a normal sponge would. and that could be frustrating. Now that could easily be solved by me just buying some sponge cloth and replacing this with a regular sponge, which I may actually do. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I'm not really a fan of this sponge that comes with the Army Painter, but I do like the form factor, so I think I have to make a compromise between the Army Painter and the Masterson, make some sort of Frankenstein in between the two. Switching between the different wet palettes that I've used, that hasn't really changed the painting at all. Every wet palette functions pretty much the same, no matter what wet palette you use, whether it's the DIY wet palette or one of the more expensive wet palettes on the market. They're all going to function the exact same way. It's using the wet palette in itself that was the level up for me. And the more I used the wet palette, the more comfortable I got with it, and the smoother my coats became over time. Using the wet palette also made it easier for me to create glazes with my paint. And adding the glaze technique to my tool belt is also a level up, and I attribute that solely to the wet palette. The wet palette made glazing for me 10 times easier. Well, there you have it, peeps, my very first level up moment, the wet palette. If you are a new painter or someone who's never given the wet palette a try and you're frustrated with your painting, try out the wet palette and see if that helps you improve. Well, peeps, what was your first level up moment? What was that first thing that really took your painting up a notch? Let me know in the comments section down below. Remember to like, share, subscribe, all that other social media stuff. It really does help out the channel a lot. For now, I've got to fly. As always, keep on painting, peeps.